Hi, thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Amelia Holmes. I'm the Director of Collections and Research Services, and joining us tonight is Barbara Ann White. She is a NHA Research Fellow and retired history teacher of the Nantucket Public School system. Barbara is most recently the author of Disturber of Tradition, A Portrait of Anna Gardner, but she's also the author of A Line in the Sand, The Battle to Integrate Nantucket Public Schools, 1825 to 1847, and Live to the Truth, The Life and Times of Cyrus Peirce, among others. Thank you so much for joining us, and now we're going to hand it over to you, Barbara.
Thank you, Amelia, and good afternoon, everyone. I originally titled this talk Suffrage Through the Eyes of Anna Gardner, but I really should have called it Suffrage Through the Actions and Beliefs of Anna Gardner, because Anna put her beliefs into action. This talk focuses on Anna Gardner's participation in women's suffrage, but I want to make it clear that Anna's passion for civil rights for Black Americans was equally, if not more intense, as her passion for women's suffrage. Her causes coalesced around her unshakable belief in equality between men and women, between Black and white, between rich and poor. She embraced abolition, equal access to public education, temperance, and suffrage. Abolition took precedence in her early years, and it was in that movement that she honed the techniques and strategies that she used throughout her life to effect change. Anna's childhood and family helped to determine the trajectory of her life in civil rights. She had strong and politically involved parents who supported their gifted daughter. Both, for example, were involved in abolition and willing to put their beliefs into action. Most of this audience knows the story of Hannah and Oliver Gardner hiding the Arthur Cooper family in their house in 1822 when Anna was only 6 years old, to prevent the Coopers from being dragged back into enslavement. This was a formative event for Anna that she recalled well into her old age, vividly describing the terror she saw on the faces of the Coopers. Outside of her family, Anna had powerful mentors and friends. She received a far better than average education for anyone at the time, but especially for a girl. Her teachers bolstered her belief in the equal potential of women, as well as in her own potential. She attended the Friends Boarding School, now known as the Moses Brown School in Providence, Rhode Island, for 2 years. And when she returned home, she enrolled in William Mitchell's private school. He was, by the way, the father of Maria Mitchell. Both these schools taught boys and girls the same subjects, not always the case back then. While in her teens, Anna chose to become a teacher. This decision charted the course of her life because she had to choose her profession over marriage, because married women were not hired as teachers at the time. She applied her philosophy of teaching and her commitment to civil rights by teaching in 2 schools for Black children on Nantucket. These experiences left her in no doubt about the potential of Black children. Most of you know that she was a teacher at the one-room African school where she prepared Eunice Ross to take and pass the high school entrance examination, setting off a 6-year struggle to integrate the Nantucket Public Schools. It is no surprise that Anna's star pupil was a young woman. While most of American society was segregated by race and gender, even when Anna was in her 20s, she belonged to a number of clubs and organizations, Black and white. An early example would be the Nantucket Anti-Slavery Society. The national abolition movement split in 1839 over the question of admitting women to the organization as equals. The group, led by William Lloyd Garrison, insisted on fully accepting women, and that stance led to the schism. Nantucket's local abolitionist society aligned with the Garrisonians, and Anna Gardner, age 23, became its first recording secretary. She played an instrumental role in organizing the annual anti-slavery conventions held on the island during August during most of the 1840s. It was at Nantucket's convention in 1841 that Anna met the young Frederick Douglass. The two became lifelong friends and political soulmates. His influence was also formative to her beliefs and future actions. During Anna's long teaching career, both on Nantucket and in the South, Anna fought for equal pay for women and aspired to leadership positions, generally reserved for men. For example, on Nantucket, once the public schools were integrated, she became the principal of 2 schools. When she was hired later by the Freedmen's Bureau, she fought for and received pay equal to that of male principals. In 1853, Anna attended a lecture on Nantucket by the suffragist Lucy Stone, and the two formed an enduring friendship. The following year, 1854, Anna gave a lecture at Pantheon Hall here about women. 4 years later, in 1858, Anna submitted a petition to the Massachusetts legislature signed by 277 fellow islanders. Whereas the women of the state of Massachusetts are disenfranchised by the Constitution solely on account of their sex, we do respectfully demand for them the right of suffrage, a right which involves all other rights of citizenship and one that cannot justly be withheld, as the following admitted principles of government show. First, all men are created equal. Second, government derives its just powers from the consent of the governed. Third, taxation and representation are inseparable. The second name on the petition, after Anna's, is that of her mother, and the third, that of her sister Sarah. Further down are signatures of her father and of her former student, Eunice Ross, and other members of the Black community. The Boston Herald mocked Anna's petition, calling women fanciful creatures. The Herald wrote that Anna considered herself part of a bold sisterhood of Nantucket, which was not considered a compliment. They argued that happy wives, good mothers, and affectionate sisters did not want the right to vote. Otherwise, it was argued, the women of the state would flood the legislature with their remonstrances. Anna taught for 12 years in several Freedmen's Bureau schools in the South. During that time, she was the principal of 2 of them, which put her into positions of authority. Her most lasting legacy was the founding of the Jefferson School, a school that included grades from primary through the most advanced class, what was then called a normal class, term used for teacher training. Within days of arriving in Charlottesville, Virginia, she chose Isabella Gibbons as her first teacher in training. Isabella went on to a long teaching career. Isabella, incidentally, was recently honored in a monument on the University of Virginia campus dedicated to all those known to have been enslaved there. When it came time to create a board of governors for the Jefferson School, Anna fought to get at least one woman on the board. In the end, she reluctantly compromised on that issue in order to get Black men on the board. Anna was encouraged by the heady and encouraging, but ultimately far too brief period of radical Reconstruction when the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were added to the Constitution. However, the 14th Amendment inserted the word male to the Constitution for the first time, and the 15th Amendment guaranteed suffrage to Black men, not women. This caused a problem for the suffragists, and the movement split into 2 camps in 1869. The National Woman Suffrage Association, NWSA, and the American Woman Suffrage Association, the AWSA. Because women were excluded in the 15th Amendment, the NWSA, under the leadership of Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, opposed it. The AWSA supported the ratification of the 15th Amendment, and most of the former abolitionists joined the AWSA, believing, as Frederick Douglass told them, it was the Negro's hour. Douglass pointed out that Black men were of the highest priority then because they were, quote, molested, beaten, shot, stabbed, hanged, and burnt, and were the target of all that is malignant in the North and all that is murderous in the South. Douglass acknowledged the mistreatment and exploitation of Black and white women, but he said their cause was not as urgent as that of Black men. Although a fervent suffragist, Anna has seen firsthand the atrocities visited upon Black men in the South, and she agreed with her old friend on this issue. The split in the suffrage movement lasted until 1902, the year after Anna's death. The mainstream suffrage movement never did embrace Black women on equal footing, and all too often jettisoned the cause of Black women in favor of political expediency to gain white women the vote. Meanwhile, the AWSA had lost faith in the federal government's will to enact reform, and as Reconstruction ended, the stage was set for white supremacists to retake the South. Conservatives swept back into power there, and business interests dominated the nation as a whole. Simply, our country chose to ignore the ascendancy of the former Confederates and threw away the opportunity to help the freed people become full citizens of this country, a consequence that has plagued us ever since. The AWSA chose to tackle what they could within the rigged power structure. The organization chose to concentrate on suffrage at local and state levels, mostly in the North and West. Not surprisingly, one of the acceptable areas for the white male establishment to consider granting women the right to vote was for local school committee elections. Women's opinions about education were considered somewhat tolerable because of their traditional roles taking care of children, not to mention the number of women in the teaching profession. This was far short of what Anna wanted, but Anna was wise enough to be aware that the causes she championed would not be attained in her lifetime. She seized opportunities to advance her ideals whenever it was possible. Discouraged at times, she had the ability to look further, not unlike the vision of Nelson Mandela, Rosa Parks, Mahatma Gandhi, and Frederick Douglass. Like them, Anna focused on the future. Anna retired from teaching in 1875 and returned to Nantucket. She did not, however, retire from her causes, and in fact had more time to devote to them. Within weeks of her return, she was elected vice president of the Nantucket Suffrage Club, which boasted 69 male and female members at a time when the population of Nantucket had dwindled to about 3,200 people. Local suffragists gained headway that year. Judith J. Fish and Elizabeth C. Crosby were elected to the school committee, even though only men could vote. During the 4 more years it took Massachusetts to grant women the right to vote in school committee elections, the men of Nantucket elected at least one woman every year. Also that year, the Athenaeum named its first women trustees, school teacher Ellen O. Swain and Anna's dear friend, the Venerable Eliza Starbuck Barney, who had spoken 36 years before in favor of women's full and equal participation at the National Anti-Slavery Convention. Anna wrote about the importance of voting for the school committee. She noted that it was particularly pertinent on the island, quote, where women constitute so large a majority of the inhabitants and where there are so many ex-teachers who have proved their fitness for the position by their complete success in their profession. 1876 was the centennial of the United States and an active year for Anna regarding suffrage. In January, Nantucketers submitted a petition with 292 names to the state legislature favoring women's suffrage at all levels of government. No action was taken on it. Also in 1876, Nantucket's Republican Party invited women to attend a meeting to select delegates to their statewide convention in Worcester. 2 of those in attendance were Anna and Eliza Barney, never ones to turn down the political opportunity to represent women. Anna's biggest contribution, however, came in October that year, when she took to the national stage at the 4th Women's Congress, fittingly convened in Philadelphia. The Women's Congress was a yearly event organized by the AAW, the Association for the Advancement of Women. The AAW did not include suffrage as one of its goals. The leaders were convinced that fighting for the vote would hinder their acceptance by a majority of men and women because suffrage was considered a radical and extremist movement. The AAW instead focused on advancing women in higher education and in the workplace. But the 4th Congress was convened by Nantucket-born Maria Mitchell, president of the AAW that year. And under Mitchell's leadership, the AAW broke with their policy not to discuss suffrage that year, causing controversy amongst the members. Invited to speak, among them Lucy Stone and Nantucket-born Lucretia Coffin-Mott, then in her 80s. Anna spoke on the 3rd day. In her lengthy address, she stressed the necessity of women being able to vote and demanded the low legal state of women be changed. She encouraged women to avail themselves of every opportunity to show what she can accomplish, she said, and called upon them to be placed on an equal footing with man. Anna took on some arguments frequently used against women's suffrage. She tackled the contention that women were not independent enough to vote, that they would simply vote the way that their husbands and sons and fathers told them to. She argued that having the vote would actually have the opposite effect, that it would help women to become more independent. Voting, she said, would be an evolutionary step toward broadening women's knowledge and interest in politics. The ballot is the best preparation for the ballot, she declared. Anna rejected the claim that women were inherently inferior to men, blaming the culture for hampering women in every department of mental endeavor. Drudgery, she said, hemmed her in and tethered her to domestic work. Take that away, and there was no limit to what women could accomplish in every sphere. Anna declared that the greatest drawback to women taking their rightful place in society was women themselves, urging them not to succumb to the male view that they weren't interested in voting. She lamented the generations of keen minds wasted by countless ages of subordination. Suffrage, she said, was the keystone of all the other rights for women. Women, Anna told the crowd, would continue to be treated as belonging to a lower rank without the vote. Even if women received the benefits of higher education, as evidenced by the growing number of women doctors, professors, and lawyers, Anna declared that women would never attain the highest possibilities of womanhood without the right to vote. She said, "The time has fully arrived for that large class of women who are still under the delusion that weakness and dependence are the prime attractions of the sex to throw off the shackles that have been so insidiously forged about them." Anna predicted there would be a time when men and women's roles would be interchangeable, calling the artificial boundaries separating the genders as simply absurd. This radical vision was unimaginable to almost everyone at that time. It was not until 3 years after Anna's speech that Massachusetts passed a law permitting women to vote in school committee elections. In 1879, Anna was elected by the local suffragists to command the effort to register women. It was not an easy task. The initial meeting about registration attracted less than 40 people, disappointing in light of the almost 300 who had signed the petition just 3 years before demanding women's full suffrage. Anna's committee went into full swing that summer, organizing meetings in churches and halls across the island. They tried to broaden their appeal by linking suffrage to the more popular and then mainstream cause of temperance, arguing that women's votes would result in, quote, great and important progress in suppressing the rum traffic. The Inquirer published instructions to women on how to vote. Women were reminded to go to the assessor's office with a written form and a list of their taxable property, as the law required them to have paid taxes for 2 years in their own names. The burden of proof was on the women, they were reminded, and the instructions made it clear that it was not the assessor's job to do it for them. A week after the directions were published, only 9 women had registered. The suffragists persevered, and by the time they came to vote in 1880, only 13 women were registered. Anna's sister, Lydia Macy, cast that first historic vote. Beforehand, there was apprehension about how the women would be received by the men. The paper noted there were no disruptions when the women filed in as a group to vote. Before the next election in 1881, the suffragists published the following plea in the paper. "To the women, taxpayers of Nantucket, the law of the state gives us the right to vote for school committee. And small though this crumb of the loaf may seem to some of us, we feel that it forces upon us a responsibility that we as mothers and citizens, interested in the welfare of the young of our island, dare not thrust aside. Will you then, at the coming election, aid the cause by voting for a woman to fill one of the vacancies that will occur?" And their plea was effective. The number of women who voted that year almost doubled from 13 to 25, proving Anna's prediction that the ballot was the best preparation for the ballot. The numbers continued to increase. By 1884, the number had risen to 106, and in 1885, it had climbed to 176. In 1888, age 72, Anna traveled to Washington to attend the International Council of Women. She stayed for several weeks at Frederick Douglass's home, Cedar Hill. Anna is only one of 5 non-family members documented to have stayed at Frederick Douglass's home. In Washington, Anna attended receptions and speeches along with hundreds of suffragists. Frederick Douglass addressed the meeting, saying that he had long been associated with the women's movement. But, he said, looking over the audience, he was struck by the many able and eloquent women in attendance. Although men like him were present, Douglass said, they had very little business here as speakers, for this is an international council not of men, but of women, and women should have all the day. This is her day in court. Anna continued to venture off island to attend suffrage conventions as long as she was able. Her obituary in the Woman's Journal, for which she wrote until the year she died, noted that she went almost yearly to Boston for 22 years to attend state suffrage conventions. And while she did not live to see the ratification of the 19th Amendment, Anna was in no doubt that women would eventually get full suffrage. When I was asked to participate in this series by the NHA, I misunderstood at first what my task was. I thought I was being asked to talk about the entire history of American women's suffrage through to the present, keeping in mind what I thought Anna would have made of it. So I set about deeply reading about the history of suffrage since Anna's death in 1901. It took me only a few weeks and 40 pages of notes later for me to realize that what I was trying to do was worthy of a full semester of lectures. I called Amelia at the NHA and she thankfully set me straight, telling me to focus on Anna Gardner's role in suffrage. However, it turns out it was a gift to have misunderstood my assignment because it made me read or reread books and articles on the topic. And I want to recommend 3 books, 2 of which were written for this year's centennial of the 19th Amendment. The first is Vanguard by Martha S. Jones, published in September. Jones documents the scope and methodology of Black women in suffrage and civil rights from the early 1800s till today. Jones wrote the book because she said that the nation was at risk for forgetting Black women's side of the story. The second is Suffrage by Ellen Carroll Du Bois, another comprehensive book published this year. As she was writing, she said that her book took on more urgency when Donald Trump was elected. She had fully expected that her book would come out after the election of our first woman president. And the third book is The Woman's Hour by Elaine Weiss, who spoke at the 2019 Nantucket Book Festival. It details the exciting battle in Tennessee, of all places, as it became the state whose vote ensured the success of the 19th Amendment. I've no doubt that had Anna been alive, she would have been active in the ratification movement and incensed that Massachusetts failed to vote in favor of it. And Anna would not have been content with women simply getting the vote. She would have recognized it as what she called an evolutionary step toward broad participation of women in all aspects of life, political, economic, and social. It's important to realize that Anna Gardner was not a moderate. As an abolitionist and suffragist, she was a member of movements considered extreme and militant at the time, something that is often overlooked today as we look back. Anna would have agitated against the continued white male dominance across every aspect of our society. Anna would have championed wage equality, joined the fight against child labor, and fought for the right of women to control their own bodies. She would be part of the movement to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment, which has languished unratified since 1972. She would have been especially concerned to see the persistence of institutional and deeply ingrained racism well over a century after her death. She would have been supportive and active in both the Me Too and in the Black Lives Matter movements. Anna recognized that the battle for equality and human rights would continue, had to continue. Conservative forces will come up with excuses not to extend equality, always saying, no, that's too much, no, that's too far. We have to move slowly. Progressives like Anna continue to push for more rights, push for more knowledge, and push to extend democracy. There is no doubt where Anna would stand today and where her energies would have been focused. Her causes are as relevant now as they were during her lifetime. And now I will turn it back to Amelia.
Hi, Barbara. Great. Thank you so much. That was just really great. You know that I'm very fond of Anna Gardner now. So I really always enjoy hearing about her. So we're going to do a Q&A. So if anyone wants to submit their questions into the chat box, I will ask those questions of Barbara. So we have about 30 minutes for questions. So the first question that we have is, can you just share again what those 2 books were that you mentioned?
Yes.
And just tell us about them one more time?
These are brand new, 2020 books, the first 2. Vanguard by Martha S. Jones is rather encyclopedic in its scope. So it goes through a lot of names, and you don't need to memorize the names. It just really goes through, starting with the 1830s and goes right up through 2020 with I think the last chapter talks about people like Stacey Abrams in Georgia trying to register voters. It's really good. I learned a lot. I learned a lot as considering I'm a Black Studies major. I learned quite a lot about Rosa Parks in here that I didn't know before. And the other one came out in February called Suffrage. This Ellen Carroll Dubois has written several books about women's history, and she wrote this one, as I said, to prepare for the ratification of the 19th Amendment and books. And so she takes an also rather encyclopedic broad sweep through American history and suffrage. They're both really good.
Great, thanks, Barbara. So we've had a question come in. Do you now know who the other 5 guests that Frederick Douglass had at his home?
Oh, I don't. I do have it on my computer at home. One was a woman named Catherine Impey, who was a British woman who was edited a newspaper called Anti-Caste, which talked a lot about racism and colonialism in the British Empire. And interestingly, her newspaper was one that Anna subscribed to. Those are the only 2 that come to me off the top of my head.
Sure, thanks. So we've had a question come in. This is a popular question. Can you go a little bit deeper into the split between the abolitionists and the suffragists?
Yes. The 2 suffrage organizations, one led by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, really their primary focus was women's suffrage. And so when the 14th Amendment added the word male, this to them was a red flag. And when the 15th Amendment followed it and gave suffrage to Black men, this was a second red flag. And they decided to oppose those amendments on that basis, figuring that they wanted the whole loaf then. And they were not willing to take a back seat, if you will, and have women not get suffrage. The AWSA, which was more made up of a lot of the former abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison, like Lucretia Mott, like Anna, like Frederick Douglass, chose to support the 15th Amendment granting suffrage to Black men because they felt it was a much more serious priority at the time. They thought, I think, that women's suffrage would be much closer on the heels of Black men's suffrage. And then when Reconstruction ended, which I always felt Reconstruction is a misnomer for that period in our history, but when that ended, the hopes of women getting the vote really faded quickly, as civil rights took a back seat in reference to Black Americans as well. And so it was a very serious split in the suffrage movement, where the 2 sides really did not speak to each other. And the NWSA, led by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, for a while took on a very racist train of thought in trying to get votes for women. A sad chapter.
For sure, yeah. So, and I think that kind of answers one of the questions we had that was asking about, if you could talk a little bit more about Susan B. Anthony's strategy for gaining votes in the South, and that sounds like you.
It's not my particular field of expertise, but there was an incident in the West with a man whose last name was Train that was very much a white supremacist. And for a while, there was an alliance there between that group of suffragists and him. Now, to their credit, eventually that was let go, but it did take a little bit of time. And by the end of Elizabeth, good friends again. And a part of Frederick Douglass, I think most of you know that it was in attendance at the 1848 Seneca Falls Convention. So his credential with women was really good. And the day he died, he had just spoken at a women's rights convention. So the rift between the major players did heal.
Yeah, well, thank you. I think that, even if you're not an expert, you're quite knowledgeable on it. No, that's great. Thank you. So bringing it back to Anna and to Nantucket, this is a really interesting question. So why didn't Anna run for school committee herself, do you think?
That's a good question. I think she probably, maybe she felt she was too old. She was very busy. I mean, she continued writing for the Inquirer and Mirror. She wrote for the Women's Journal. She wrote a book of poetry. She wrote her memoirs. Perhaps it was just she was too busy. She would have been a good candidate, but she didn't. I think she retired from teaching. I can identify with that. When I retired from teaching, I retired from teaching.
Yeah, sure. No, that makes sense. So can you give us I know that your book covers this, so read the book. But can you give us the timeline of Anna's residence on island? Where did she live?
Well, when she was born, she lived on what is now Vestal Street. It was called Prison Lane because of the jail on the street when she was born. And that's where she stayed. She had different places. I know when she taught in Pulpus, she lived in Pulpus on a farm when she taught at the Pulpus Schoolhouse. She bought a house on Liberty and Gardner Street. I've never quite pinpointed where it was, but it was next door to her sister Lydia and Alexander Macy. And then in 1890, she bought a house at 40 Orange Street, which is where the house she owned until she died.
Well, and she also, did you cover Pulpus? You did say that.
Yes, yeah, she lived in Pulpus.
Which I just
probably
love.
2 years, yeah.
Yeah, I love that Pulpus was just so remote at the time that she stopped attending the Wednesday meeting because it was just too much of an effort to get all the way back to town.
Well, you either walked, or you were in a wagon, or you were on a horse.
I don't know. Yeah, it just really changes. It just, I guess, like, really puts in perspective for me just how different, transport was at that time. So let's see, this question here says, thank you so much for familiarizing us with Anna's impressive story. Yes, I agree, thank you. I'm curious, how much longer did the freedmen's schools last after Anna left the South?
Well, that's a good question. Most of them went under. Depending on the state, like in Virginia, which I'm probably, and North Carolina, which I'm a little more familiar with than the others, they were absorbed in the public school system because in order to re-enter the Union, the Confederate States had to write new constitutions. And during the Reconstruction is when they were written. And so black schools were created and eventually became part of the public schools. It was at that point where Anna tried to get men and women, black men and women on the board at the Jefferson School because it had just been taken over by the public schools. It's a little bit complicated, but some of the schools lasted quite a while. We know the Jefferson School lasted into the 1900s as a segregated public school. And a number of, for me, it's a little more pertinent to ask how many of the teachers stayed teaching, and a fair amount of teachers remained teaching in the South that were trained by the Freedmen's Bureau schools.
Awesome, thank you. So this one is changing topic a little bit, but so you mentioned that women had to produce 2 years of taxes paid in their own name. Could you just tell us a little more about that? Like, what was...
I've never really been able to tease that out exactly. But women had businesses by then. A lot of women, like Anna, were single, and they owned their own homes. And I imagine that most of the women that decided to vote engineered it so they paid taxes, property taxes or that sort of thing. I'm not really entirely sure, to be honest.
This one, I feel like this might also be a little bit of an unfair question, but do we know anything about the first African-American woman to vote on the island?
I do not know that. If the town building were open now and I could get into the rolls, it was one of the questions I wanted to answer before I came here, because I know that in the NHA, in your suffrage exhibit, you have a list of names of people who voted in 1821. And I've looked at that list because it's the only one I can see right now. And there are two names that quite possibly might be African American. My friend Fran might know that answer better than me, but that is something I would really like. It's one of my quests once the town building opens up, is to get into the voter rolls.
I know, it's surprising how many censuses start these days with if only the town building were open, if we could get to the records. So those are all the questions we have for right now. So if anyone wants to submit another question, we have a little bit more time. I will say there is one question here, which is, what is your next book, Barbara?
Oh gosh, I don't know that I will ever write another book. I mean, biographies take at least 12 years. You have to follow their trails, and, you know, people like Anna and my previous biography, Cyrus Peirce, they didn't leave much personal behind. And so it really becomes a real quest for teasing out and fleshing out their stories so that they're full human beings in their full complexity. I don't know. I have a few ideas for articles, maybe more than books right now.
Well, I have to say I'm definitely looking forward to seeing what those articles were, or are, what they're going to be. Yeah, I mean, Anna's certainly a high note to end on if that's, you know, going to be your last book.
Yes.
All right, this I think is this is a good, oh wow, okay, the questions are now coming in. You say there are no more questions, and they just pulled them out. So can you talk a little bit about Samuel Jenks and why he was not in favor of why he was in favor of the public schools but not integration of those schools?
That is a very good question, and he just wasn't. He really must have believed that Black children and white children should not sit together. You know, there was an underlying fear, and I do not want to put this in Samuel Jenks's mouth because I've never read that he espoused this idea, but of dating between the races. And if you read the letters in the Inky, which unfortunately are signed by pseudonyms all the time, so it's very hard to tease out who wrote what. You know, you can sort of piece it together. I mean, I've certainly found some letters that I know were written by Nathaniel Barney, and a couple that were really clearly Cyrus Peirce's writing. But Samuel Jenks, in his role on the school committee, could not have been more against integration. I mean, he really did not believe that the school system should integrate, that it was fine to have separate but equal schools, even though they weren't equal. But
Right, but that was the argument.
Yeah.
This is going back to the requirements for women to be able to vote. Was there the same requirement for men in order to register to vote?
I do not know that, but I'm assuming it was, but
Yeah,
never
that's a good
assume
question.
without checking. So
Yeah.
a wonderful thing about questions is it makes you realize, oh my gosh, that's something I need to look up.
So true, yeah, and possibly fodder for future articles.
Exactly.
So who would you say Anna Gardner influenced the most after she died? What, besides you, who wrote her biography?
Oh, you know, if I were ever going to write another book, one of the ones that's always sort of appealed to me is this person led to this person led to this person. You know, like in police, they talk about the blue line. And I've always thought it would be so interesting to trace, you know, let's just start with Cyrus Peirce because he taught Anna, or William Mitchell, and Anna taught Vera Sickles, or was a Nantucket woman who went on to become one of the first person to write a book about drama, or Isabella Gibbons, or other people in the South. I mean, Isabella Gibbons would be a nice route because we can trace some of the Black kids that she taught who then became teachers or whatever. So I'm sure she certainly influenced her sisters and her nieces and nephews. Certainly that would be, you know, one group of people that she influenced. But it's interesting, in Charlottesville, in her school, after she left and she was teaching somewhere else in the South, the school chose to have an election, a mock election for president and vice president, and they nominated Anna Gardner for president. So I think that's very cool.
Yeah, well, it certainly does seem like, you know, I mean, the Jefferson School, the building is still there, so I would say that does seem like a lasting influence.
Certainly influenced them a great deal.
For sure. Well, those are all of the questions that I see here in the chat. So I just want to thank you, Barbara, so much for taking the time to talk to us tonight. A wealth of knowledge.
Thank you. I really look forward to having a real audience. It's so much more difficult to talk into a camera.
I know, yeah, it's, you know, there's plenty of us here tonight, but you're just sitting up there by yourself. And I just want to say thank you to everyone else for spending a portion of their evening with me and Barbara. This is our last NHA University webinar focused on women's history. Please join us in November and December as we learn about Black history. More information on those lectures will be available soon. Programs such as this one are made possible thanks to the support of our members. If you are not a member, please consider joining by heading to nhA.org/membership. And thanks so much and have a great night.